All right, so last lecture, which was 2 weeks ago exactly, I did a brief history of AI from the early days through to the present, and talked about what I understood to be the main factors in the major technological revolution which we've been seeing over the last few years. Tracing it to three main factors. One are some very major improvements in computational hardware in the form of GPUs, which are very fast parallel processing chips, graphical processing units originally developed for gaming, as well as the sudden burst of digital information for training neural networks. But the main factor was serious and radical improvements in architectures of neural network systems, the first generation giving us highly refined recurrent neural networks with filtering devices for memory to capture unbounded or long-distance dependencies, as well as convolutional neural networks. And then the second generation coming through sophisticated embeddings, which are vectorized representations, abstract representations of data distribution patterns, giving us geography or geometry of distributional patterns of words and other data patterns, and attention, which is a way of creating what I described as a dynamic context vector that allows alignment of input and output in a more refined basis. Today is going to be largely non-technical. I know that's a disappointment. We're going to talk about the risks of the AI revolution. Some, I will argue, imagined and some real. So we'll start out with the kind of Terminator, the Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminator scenario, which takes the form of super intelligent agents, and I'll argue that that's not something, we can't dismiss it, but it's not something that's imminent or that we need to worry about immediately. Move on to the issue of how we estimate the likelihood of unseen risk, previously unseen risk, which is really what we have to talk about if we want to evaluate and assess the danger of that we're constantly being warned about in the press and by various writers about super intelligent agents. And then I'll, kind of second half of the talk, discuss the actual dangers of AI, what I take to be the pressing and real, present, imminent, not imminent, actual pressing threats and dangers of AI, which are often different than those that people might initially think of when they're asked to enumerate them, but because they don't receive the same kind of dramatic press coverage or media coverage. So the first term is singularity. You may have heard of it. If not, it's a term that describes, futurologists have used to describe the emergence of intelligence in general intelligence and machine. Last week we discussed the issue of general intelligence and told you I didn't really believe it as a project for AI, but that's another issue. We'll get more deeply into that. But the term singularity was used to describe, it has been used to describe the emergence of general artificial intelligence in circuitry, in computational circuitry. The term, I tried to trace it. The first reference seems to be in memoir by a person called Ulam, who wrote a memorial article for von Neumann. Von Neumann, major Hungarian American mathematician and computer scientist, apparently in a conversation with Ulam referred to some essential singularity, referring not to intelligence as such, artificial intelligence, but to a situation where technology transforms the conditions of human life so that they never go back to what they could have been before. So that's where the term seems to have come from. But then it came to be identified with the notion of superintelligence in computing devices with Good, who is actually a pretty eminent computer scientist and mathematician, British originally, who moved to the States, and I discussed some of his work last week, Good Turing, and we'll come back to that. So Good actually, in an article in '66, anticipates an exponential increase in computing storage and memory capacity. This was '66, so he was kind of ahead of his time on that. And he allowed for the development, he imagined the development of massively parallel neural networks connected to large data sets. Again, in '66, this wasn't actual. But he then took a step further and imagined these devices becoming integrated and engaging in generalized inference and reasoning in such a way that they improved their own design. So they were self-improving, which gave rise, on his account, to successive cycles of increasingly powerful superintelligent agents. So each generation would be smarter than the previous one, and they would kind of reproduce. So he predicts in the 66 article the creation of the first ultra-intelligent device by the end of the 20th century. It didn't happen. And I'll argue it wasn't an accident that it didn't happen. So he got a lot right about the direction that AI and computing would take. From the perspective of 66, that's exceptional, but not on the issue of the emergence of generalized superintelligence. Another computer scientist, we're still dealing with computer scientists who actually know what they're talking about. The discussion then gets taken over, what's the term, appropriated. So instead of culturally appropriated, scientifically appropriated by people who are not necessarily involved in science and engineering, and at that point it becomes, to use a polite term, imaginative. Vange in '93 regards the rapid rise of powerful hardware and the emergence of the internet, which was at that point in its infancy, together with combinations of brains and microchips, which he envisaged as the three factors that will cause computational systems to, in his words, come alive. They'll somehow come alive as intelligent agents. So this is in his '93 article. And he sees this process as essentially inevitable. Now, interestingly enough, he warns of the dangers that this kind of development will pose, but he also recognizes its benefits, as does Good before him, and as does the next person who will discuss. So they have a kind of fairly balanced view of what they see superintelligent agents producing. They see them as producing tremendous benefit, but also danger. So there's a kind of mixed view here. He, that is Vange, reflects on the options for how to encode safety constraints in superintelligent agents, which became and still is very much a topic of conversation. And now we come to perhaps one of the more luxurious and scenarios that Kurzweil, who himself is a computer scientist in his background, but very much a futurologist. He imagines in a series of publications a very elaborate development of singularity. So first of all, he uses Moore's law, which I think most of you have heard about. That's the law of exponential increase in computing power in a microchip, so that every 18 months, microchips, and we're still talking about CPUs here, this is not even GPUs, would double their computing power. And he claims that this exponential pattern is actually pervasive in the natural order and in particularly in biological evolution, but it's also present in social domains. And what he envisions as a result of this is that an ever-increasing interaction of electronic chips in human brains. So he's taking Vange's idea and pursuing it to a more extreme conclusion. He envisages these chips being inserted into the brain, but he also imagines nanorobots, which are intelligent, entering the bloodstream and contributing to cognitive enrichment of the brain that way. He even goes as far as to say that he foresees a situation in the future where people can and do upload their entire mental identity as encoded in the brain onto an electronic circuit board. Okay, so this is why he calls these devices spiritual machines. So that's Kurzweil. You'll get a sense of how I react to this. I'm trying to use fairly neutral language to describe it. So just to give you a sense of Moore's law, which actually is proven prescient, because he proposed it in the 60s, and it's held for well over 50 years. It's into its 60th year. And this is a graph from an Intel publication. Moore originally was an engineer working for Intel, which produced microchips and still does. And here you see the graph plotting as a straight line an exponential growth in computing power, as measured by the number of circuits which can be etched on microscopically on chips, on microchips, CPU microchips. And then, of course, we have GPUs, which continue this trend. The fact is, however, if you look closely at Kurzweil's claim, most patterns in both the natural and the social order are not actually permanently exponential. This is illusory. If you look at a certain period, you get an exponential growth, but over a longer period of time, it tends not to hold. So even though there might be a very sharp burst of expansion in biological systems or in technological and social systems, it doesn't generally last. So, for example, in biology, most species, after they reach a certain level of adaptation and viability, will tend to become stable over a long period of time. It's certainly true of the lower organisms, which have been in their present form for millions and millions of years. But it's even true of higher primates like us. Certainly, most species of apes and monkeys have not changed significantly. There may have been minor evolutions that haven't changed significantly in several million years. So this is just not true about biology. You see it even more clearly in population growth. So population growth will very often be explosive. That is, it'll be highly exponential for a period and then level off. This is exactly what's happening to human population growth. So if you look at major population centers, China, North America, and the Eurasian continent, you're seeing a leveling off, and many countries are actually quite concerned about the decline in population growth. Britain is a particularly extreme case because of the economic issues and implications. You'll have an aging workforce that will be in retirement, and the available emerging workforce won't be sufficient to support it. That's so. Now, technology actually seems to follow a similar pattern. So there'll be, for all of our view of ourselves in the beginning of the 21st century, we're still in the first quarter, as revolutionary. Actually, if you look at the major technological spurt, it was a century ago. It was the first half of the 20th century, which gave us flight and internal combustion engines and electricity and a great deal else. And new technologies, of course, have emerged since then and have had a major impact both economically and socially. But you'll find that all of these technologies, once they reach a certain level of maturity, will tend to level off. Think of mobile phone design, think of air flight, of aircraft. So actually most of the aircraft we see along, there are obvious design changes and some of them important, but they still are working according to the basic design models of 50 years ago, jet aircraft, helicopters and whatnot, even spacecraft. So the pattern that you find isn't really exponential, it's a sigmoid function, which is a well-known function in mathematics and computer science, and it looks like this. This is a logistic sigmoid function, and there's a simple equation that generates that. We talked about these functions last time because they were used for filtering in certain kinds of RNNs, recurrent neural networks, but they also serve as a pretty accurate reflection of growth in both biology and in the technological realm of the social order. Sorry. Let's go and look a little more closely at the arguments that we've seen so far from the three futurologists who are computer scientists, and hence people we ought to take seriously because they are amongst the people who helped lay the foundations in engineering and mathematical terms for some of the work that we're doing now. Their arguments for the singularity, the three people we discussed, suffer from some weaknesses. The first weakness in this argument, and the main one as I see it, is that they assume that intelligence follows somehow automatically, this notion of general intelligence, from computer power and simulation of brain activity. You put those two together, increased computer power and functional simulation of brain activity, and you will get, as a virtually automatic entailment, general intelligence. And this is, as far as I'm concerned, a non sequitur. It just doesn't follow. So let's go back to Turing, who again we talked about last week, 2 weeks ago, sorry, who in his 1950 article, gave us the Turing test, and Turing argues, in my view, persuasively, that defining general intelligence is essentially meaningless. You can't do it. We don't have the resources for a scientific theory. In my view, we never will, but that's an open question. But we certainly don't have anything resembling a definition, nor is it likely that we could construct one. So he assumes an operational approach, which is why he comes up with the Turing test, which these days is looking increasingly fragile in light of large language models and the ease with which they can generate natural dialogue. But while we can't define or even develop a scientific theory of any kind of general intelligence, in my view, it is possible, I think, to, following this operational approach, to identify markers of intelligent behavior, right? This is a kind of operational approach where you just say, well, if I know it when I see it, what is it that you see it by? These would be sort of symptoms to diagnose the presence of intelligence. And I'd see three of them as crucial. I'm not proposing this as either necessary sufficient conditions or anything of the kind, just indicators or markers. So first of all, intelligent agent is goal-directed, pursues an objective in a purposeful way. I'm talking about general intelligence, not the task-specific intelligence of weak AI that we discussed last week. Second, an agent is volitional, which means it chooses its goals and the ways that it achieves them. And that's crucial, I think. Third, it employs rational methods of efficiency and consideration of relative advantage for planning and implementation to realize these objectives over a wide range of domains. So that kind of choice of methods for and planning seem also to be major ingredients of general intelligence. Now, it's important to note that these are emergent properties of biological systems. They're not uniquely human. There are many higher biological forms, including some that you wouldn't think of as intelligent, that manifest them, whether they be birds, certainly higher mammals, but even other kinds of creatures who manifest these in some degree or other. So I'm not claiming these are human specific. But they are emergent, which means that you can't reduce them to the sum total of their parts. They're not specifically biological properties, and you can't do a convenient kind of compositional analysis where you say, I'll have a function that'll take a sequence of these physical and biological properties and will output these kinds of properties. So they are properly emergent. And as a result, there's no reason to assume that they'll simply arise in an electronic system, like a computer, by virtue of the device's complexity or the success with which it functionally simulates brain behavior. Okay, now we're going to go to philosophers. And if you think linguists cause trouble, oh boy, philosophers can create a certain amount of havoc. And here's an example where I think they do. I mean, in an interesting way, but beware. So Searle, this is John Searle, in 1980, did a review of a book which we're going to mention soon. And he uses what's called the Chinese room argument. That's his argument that you can't do translation unless you have proper mental activity. So even if you follow rules slavishly, if you haven't learned a language by it as a form of internal representation, you can't translate properly. If the details are not clear, don't worry about it. But he uses that argument to claim that machines, in principle, cannot become conscious. So for him, the issue of general intelligence reduces to the issue of whether a machine can be conscious. Okay. By contrast, David Chalmers, another philosopher, an Australian, takes the contrary view. He says that artificial devices can acquire conscious mental states if they achieve a certain level of computational functionality. Now, there are two ways of understanding them. One is a trivial way. It's definitional. If an artificial device, like a computer, behaves according to certain functional criteria, you call it conscious. That's trivial. And in effect, Turing already anticipated this idea, that of a definitional use of that term. The other more interesting sense is that consciousness will arise naturally, and Chalmers believes in a full-blooded sense of internal mental life and internal mental states when he says consciousness, that it'll arise when you achieve this level of computational functionality. I'm going to discard the trivial definitional sense and worry only about the latter sense, because that's the one that's, it seems to me, that's worth thinking about. So remember that I'm adopting Turing's operational approach to intelligence, because to me it seems the only one that's viable or rational. On this approach, whether or not a computational device is conscious or self-aware or has internal mental states is entirely irrelevant. It's entirely orthogonal to the problem of superintelligence. There's no reason whatsoever to require computational devices to have internal mental states in order to credit them with intelligence, right? So I'm trying, in other words, to give the other side the strongest possible case here. We should not require internal mental states of computers as a condition for recognizing them as manifesting general intelligence, because that's irrelevant. The three operational criteria that I suggested for symptoms of intelligence do not assume internal mental activity. They can be identified entirely on the basis of the way these things operate and compute. So I want to treat internal mental states, consciousness is irrelevant. That's something that people have. There's no reason to expect artificial agents to have them. And therefore, to me, this is an example of philosophers confusing the issue, right? This is not relevant to what we're really talking about. But a lot of ink has been spilled on this. So let's, again, go back to some of the earlier arguments that we saw from the computer science futurologists. So computers are already far more powerful than brains in storage capacity and computing speed. They have been for a long time. Also in their accuracy of computation. I mean, even calculators are, and certainly computers. Moreover, they're designed for engineering performance and not for analogy to human neural systems, right? So in this respect, they're like aircraft. We don't design aircraft to resemble birds or bees or other flying creatures, right? We design them in order to achieve certain engineering effects, to fly at 30 to 40,000 feet at maximum stability and storage ability and whatnot. Now, why is all this interesting? Because it seems to me this simply strengthens my initial claim that it doesn't follow that by taking vastly increased computational power and even throwing in closer approximation to human neural activity, that we're going to get the emergent properties of intelligent behavior. They're not just going to suddenly appear. Okay? This is a kind of Frankenstein idea, right? Except Frankenstein was actually a corpse, so he had a biology to him. But the idea was you run, if you remember the original Frankenstein, if you didn't see it, maybe you saw the Gene Wilder, the Mel Brooks film, The Young Frankenstein. So when they move, when they put electricity through the brain of this body, it becomes alive and conscious. So there's no reason to expect that to happen in circuitry that's artificial. The Frankenstein myth has actually greater credibility in that these are biological or formerly biological devices. All that said, you see why I can't take the notion of superintelligence as something threatening at this particular point. However, that said, it is necessary to acknowledge that the notion of singularity is a logical possibility. That is, it's logically possible, it's conceptually coherent to imagine computational devices coming alive in the terms of Winch and Good, and achieving that kind of intelligence that I've tried to characterize in terms of my three markers. So it's not impossible. It may at some point in the future happen that we create in computational element agents that exhibit intelligence in the sense that I've indicated here. However, and this is a crucial point, no current AI system comes anywhere close to achieving these properties. Nowhere close, regardless of what you read. I mean, we've already discussed large language models, and it's clear why they don't satisfy this. their performance on particular tasks very impressive. They're not capable of crucial kinds of inferencing, which would be part of some of the markers that are identified as ingredients of general intelligence. There's a nice paper by Mauwald and colleagues who are neuroscientists working in a lab at MIT under Evelinga Federinka. That it's a recent paper where they present extensive evidence that large language models, where their linguistic performance resembles that of humans. They have a real serious problem in handling real-world reasoning. And we're talking about current large language models. So this is exactly where these emergent properties are not there. Moreover, and here's, I think, the crucial point, it's just not clear how there would be a line from current systems to superintelligent agents, to the Terminator or anything like that. So it's not clear how foreseeable developments of current AI systems, however impressive they are, would suddenly create this kind of superintelligent agent. So what we're left with, I would try and persuade you, is that the singularity is an interesting thought experiment of imaginative futurists, but it's not an imminent prospect. In other words, it's a danger imagined. It's not a danger actual. Now, there are people who disagree very strongly with this, and here are three of them. One is Yudovsky, who in 2008 wrote an extensive paper on why we have to start already planning to inhibit and constrain these devices. There's a duel from Gothenburg, of all places, Nick Bostrom, who now is in Oxford and has been for a while, and Ole Högström, who's actually, Bostrom's a philosopher and Högström is a mathematician. Yudovsky is an autodidact who works in computer engineering in some respects. Högström's actually a serious statistician and mathematician at Chalmers. They've all written, Bostrom and Högström have written books, for example, that warn that work in AI is leading inevitably to the rise of superintelligent agents that will threaten human survival. The kind of mixed view that you got in the earlier futurologists gives way to a very dark picture of these devices taking over the world and destroying humanity. And they imagine a variety of scenarios in which agents develop in this way. Basically, they all reduce to the idea of the golem, if you're familiar with the ancient Jewish myth of the golem, where what happens is one of these devices, and they argue that it's most likely there'll only be one, adopts a certain objective, which is, I think in one case, this is Bostrom's case, wants to test something called the Riemann hypothesis, which is a hypothesis about the nature of a class of functions. And in order to do that, this device ends up completely taking over the biosphere and using it as a massive laboratory and thus destroying the environment. And a second similar device, this is also from Bostrom, decides that it needs to manufacture paper clips, or it's given the objective of manufacturing paper clips. And in order to do that, it basically takes over not only the planet, but the solar system, thus rendering life in the entire solar system. And I once gave a joint paper with my colleague Devdutt Dubashi, who was online before last time, and I had a slide that says the golem goes into the paperclip business when I tried to debunk this. Ole Högström was in the audience, and he was not amused. But these are the kinds of scenarios they imagine to flesh out this idea. So, I mean, the most you can say is, yeah, I mean, this is possible, of course. But none of the people who advocate these kinds of threats give us any reason to believe that they're likely or foreseeable in the future. Now, so far, this is just sort of skeptical complaining, saying, you haven't given me enough reason. I want to make this a little more specific, and I'll do that in the next slide. But just to remind you that the basic argument for these worries is that the power of computational technology and simulation of biological systems, particularly brains, are going to produce this automatically. And that argument is, as far as I'm concerned, a faulty argument based on unsound premises. So the observations are correct. That is, the premises are true. They're not. The premises are not false. The inference is unsound. And in addition, what they seem to be doing, is inferring an event is probable from the fact that it's possible, and that's a classic fallacy. Thank you very much. So, in order to make to lend some greater substance to that last point, let's look what's involved in estimating risk. Okay, because I mean, people make a living doing that, whether they be actuaries in insurance companies or whether they be risk assessors in security agencies or financial advisors. Assessing risk is actually a big deal, a big business, and there are lots of formal and mathematical tools for doing it, all of them involving probability theory. Now, in order to respond rationally to dangers, you have to be able to come up with some grounded assessment of risk where it's grounded in probability theory and where you can therefore rank or prioritize risks in terms of their seriousness. And there are well-developed formal tools in probability theory for assigning likelihood to unobserved classes of phenomena. One is a good Turing smoothing, which we talked about last time, came in '53, and another more contemporary smoothing technique for assigning likelihood to non-observed events, things that don't appear in a corpus, is from Kneser and Ney. These are all ways of saying, okay, there are a class of events that we haven't seen. We know that they can occur, and we have to anticipate what their likelihood is. Now, all of these methods rely on similarities between the observed events that you do see in past experience or in a corpus, whose frequency can therefore be measured, and unobserved events which have no frequency. Without those relationships of similarity, you can't begin to make sense of what's going on. For these methods to apply to an unseen event, it has to bear clear resemblance to previously encountered phenomena. So, how can we assess the nature of superintelligence? Well, the emergence of superintelligence in artificial agents doesn't resemble any previously known event. We've never seen anything like it. Okay? So the techniques of probability theory for predicting likelihood of previously unseen events just don't apply here. So that's a serious problem. So we can't quantify the likelihood as a conditional probability. Not even roughly, not even in anything resembling a formally credible way. So we can't really assess that kind of a risk. Now, superintelligent agents, therefore, stand in marked contrast to global warming due to carbon in the atmosphere. Because there, in fact, we can evaluate likelihood and measure the risk with considerable accuracy, and we've done it. We can also evaluate dangers associated with climate change and give them very precise probability values. And therefore, we are in a position to say that things like climate change, but other things too, which admit of this kind of very precise assessment, should be the actual things we're worried about. And thus our priorities for remedial action. Things like political extremism, inequality, economic inequality, pandemics, geopolitical instability. These are the things, climate change, that are pressing. And we do have ways of assessing likelihood of particular events. Even when they prove inaccurate, we can then revise them in light of data. Superintelligence isn't one of them. Now, one last word on this. It's important to distinguish between autonomous control devices and intelligent artificial agents, and there's a regular confusion between these two classes of technology that you will see in much of the literature by people who are journalists or commentators on social media or prophets of one variety or another. I won't name them, who do not worry about the engineering details or the science. So If you should not confuse an artificially intelligent agent with an anonymous control device that self-activates through external feedback. So the latter class includes things like thermostats, automatic pilots, sensory activated alarms. Those kinds of devices have been with us since the dawn of technology. These are not autonomous, these are not intelligent agents. They can be very dangerous when they're not well designed. So think of sensory activated autonomous weapons, right? But they are not to be confused with artificial intelligence. They're just dangerous forms of technology. Nothing new there. Rocks are dangerous, particularly when they're used as weapons. So the fact that a piece of technology is dangerous, badly designed, or autonomous in the sense of self-activated doesn't make it an artificially intelligent agent and shouldn't be confused with it. Automatic pilots are not AI devices. I want to talk about some real dangers in the last part of the talk. So the first one concerns the rapid growth in the size of transformer models, which we identified last time as the main second generation AI model driving large language models. So the size of such a model depends on three main factors. And the first one is the number of layers or attention blocks that we talked about in it. The second are the number of parameters in M, which corresponds to the size of its embedding. And the third is the size of the data on which it's trained. So most of the expansion has gone on in 2 and 3. And the expansion has been really rapid and substantial in recent years. To give you a sense of that, take a look at this. So ChatGPT had 1.5 billion parameters in 2019. ChatGPT-3 has 175 billion parameters. ChatGPT-4 has been estimated to have 1.76 trillion. So in a 5-year period, this is the kind of growth in crucial elements of model size, and it's happened in other models too. Similarly in training, you get that kind of enormous fast rise. ChatGPT-3, similarly in terms of training, could be trained on 1,024 A100 GPUs, whereas ChatGPT-4 needed 25,000. The cost of training ChatGPT-3 was estimated at $4 million American dollars, whereas Sam Altman is quoted as saying that the cost of training ChatGPT-4 was $100 million. These are jumps in size and cost that span 3 to 5 years. So if you want an example of very sharp increases there. Now, these create obvious environmental issues, and they're very severe. They're not always appreciated as such. So the power consumption for model training is estimated by, in an article in Bloomberg by Saul and Bass, as follows. So for ChatGPT-3.1, it consumed its training, we're just talking about its training run, 1.287 gigawatts. That's normally what would power 120 American households, and Americans are not known for being modest in energy consumption. Whereas for ChatGPT-4, its training consumed 50 gigawatts, the size of a town. The large tech companies now answer this by saying, oh, we get all our energy from renewable sources. That sounds impressive until you consider the fact that it might be true that much of their energy is renewable, but in so doing, and this is pointed out in an article by Halper and O'Donovan, they force all the other users off the grid for renewable sources, and the power companies have to then increase their use of fossil fuels to make up for the lack. So again, we're talking about very serious environmental damage here. The problems extend into chip production with toxic chemicals, amounts of water being huge. So a chip production factory can consume up to 100 megawatts of electricity an hour. We're talking about GPU as well as CPU. And they could use more than 100 million gallons of water a day. And they produce literally thousands of tons of chemical waste annually. These are not clean industries. AI companies require large data centers and server farms. They own half of Arizona to run products. And there's also these server farms take up lots of power and water. So you're getting a picture here of a major environmental issue. And it's very often not discussed in the context of AI and tech companies. Now there's another second problem, which is that actually tech companies have now, in the past 5 to 10 years, moved into a position of a near total monopoly on AI research. Those of you who are students in computer science know this very well. So the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Index report for 223 points out that as of 2022, the tech companies designed 32 leading machine learning models, whereas academic institutions a total of 3. That's not an accident. That's because, for 2 reasons. One, the size of the transformer models are such that only large private tech companies can afford to run them and to train them and to have the resources to do it. The second is of course, the amount of money that they're prepared to pay their staff. Okay, so the result of this is that these models now being the leading edge of current work, the large tech companies effectively control, in a monopoly style, research on deep learning. Now, that means the main code and the architecture of the models tend to come from these companies. There are exceptions. There are some smaller startup companies, Mistral, et cetera. They soon, if they succeed, become very big and join the tech company collage. But the result is that students and university researchers like us and small startups in the private sector become basically clients of the tech companies. So our task is increasingly fine-tuning large language models and doing tweaking through small architectural changes that we can manage in the open access code. The fact that the code is open access is irrelevant. We can't afford to build and run these models ourselves. So what you have is a near total commercialization of AI. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting that the tech companies don't do important or valuable work, or that they're a locus of, Darth Vader style evil. Although some of the stuff they do, well, we'll talk about that later. So a large part of the AI now is directed at issues that advance the immediate commercial interests of the tech companies, not even long range. So this work's of major scientific value. Last talk tried to make it clear that I value it. But the problem is that there are a lot of other stuff that's important gets neglected. So the need for smaller, efficient machine learning systems that can accurately do powerful inferencing from smaller amounts of data, there's very little work on that because it doesn't immediately yield the kind of profit. It is actually an engineering imperative as well. Many of the original cognitive issues concerning human learning and representation, which motivated early AI research, which we discussed last time, that's been kind of relegated to the margins of the field because it's not going to yield a whole lot of money unless it produces better products, which by and large isn't the issue. You might think, well, okay, this is because AI is expensive and only the private sector can handle that, but that's actually not true. So not all scientific disciplines work this way. Particle physics does not. Okay, so take the example of the Large Hadron Collider between Switzerland and France. So it was built by the governments that are members of CERN, which is the European Nuclear Research Center. Between 1998 and 2008, it cost $4.75 billion. That was coming out of the public domain. CERN continues to fund research projects in basic research in physics, and that's how the Higgs boson particle was discovered. Had we not had CERN and funding for that research, we wouldn't have had the discovery which announced in 2012 of the Higgs boson particle that is the experimental evidence for it. Okay, another problem. I'm moving through problems. Each one is a separate problem. So disinformation and deep fakes. So generative AI models fabricate deep fakes of photographs, speech, artistic performances. And this stuff is flooding the internet. And it harms the well-being of people who are being victimized by it. Documents are forged, identities are stolen, criminal groups and hostile governments are inciting civil unrest and undermining elections. This is all going on now. This is not a possible development in the future. We could find ourselves very quickly in an environment separating where we're trying to separate fact from illicit fiction becomes basically impossible. Think of medical, clinical trials that are faked and people acting on them, pharmacological experiments. If that stuff's fake, what are we going to rely on? A lot of journals are already no longer reliable. And at that point, the conditions for organized social activity and communication just start to become unstuck. Unfortunately, we're seeing it. It's a very acute problem. Okay. How do we verify? Well, in order to do remedial work to prevent disinformation, I mentioned RAG as a procedure, which is a technique for updating a large language model by fine-tuning online and other data, and we found that it didn't work particularly well. And my colleague, Dr. Bashi, points out that a lot of the material that we used online to validate is itself possibly infected with non-factual content, either maliciously or innocently. Gambin et al. In a paper suggests that we use distributed ledgers. These are the kinds of systems, these are the block ledger systems that are used for cryptocurrency as hyper secure for verification. This is a completely impractical idea. It would introduce a level of computational complexity and bottlenecks in online activity which would make them unworkable. Okay, and it would also greatly aggravate the environmental problems because of what's involved in running these kind of blockchain systems. So that seems to me to be a non-starter. A more hopeful idea is digital watermarking, where you put a digital code in a source, and that allows you to verify where it came from. And lots of companies are on that. It's been around for a while. Of course, these watermarks can be counterfeited or they can be removed, but they do offer at least one line of defense, and it's worth looking into rendering them more secure. An additional problem is hate speech. So the proliferation of racist and gender-targeted abuse, as well as religious prejudice, anti-immigrant sentiment, is one of the most dangerous features of the current social media. How does that connect with AI? Well, the platform algorithms and the AI chatbots that are basically part of the social media platforms are amplifying this content for profit in order to create closed digital markets for it. The spread of hate speech becomes an organizing tool for racist groups, extremists, and terrorists of all variety. It's a terrible threat. We don't necessarily see it here amongst us, but it's all over. Recent work on using discriminative transformers like BERT to identify online hate speech has made quite a bit of progress. This falls together with sentiment analysis. The problem is using that information to actually restrict hate speech becomes a political issue. So it's a problem of public policy, and we'll discuss that next talk. If the American view is an extreme libertarian view, which all speech should be unrestricted, and there are other views in between, and we'll look at those and see. Because it's not, in that case, a problem of technology, but of policy. Bias in decision-making. AI systems are used to predict likely outcomes and evaluate risk because they are very powerful tools for giving probability distributions over events, classes of events. So they can be used for medical treatment, policing and criminal justice, finance and loan industry, on creditworthiness, hireability, and the labor market. Problem is, many of these models incorporate very serious biases that work against vulnerable groups because of their ethnic, religious, gender, socioeconomic, age, geographic, health properties, etc. There's been work on this. So Nazar et al. Did a study on predicting illness and prescribing treatment with an AI model and found that the data is widely distorted. And the cause is that if you overfit a model to the training data that it's trained on, you'll get the wrong probability distribution for a population that falls outside that particular group, the training group. Two examples. Sickle cell anemia is far more common in people of African heritage than it is Caucasians and Asians. The second example is Tay-Sachs disease is very common among Ashkenazi Jews and far less common amongst the non-Jewish population. If you basically throw them in with a general majority-based North American, European majority-based population survey, you won't get results that will necessarily pick these problems up. There are ways of, machine learning ways of trying to counteract this. One is adversarial training, using training design to compensate for overfitting. Another is fine-tuning on special populations. So there are ways of correcting for it, but it remains an ongoing research issue. AI models discriminate in hiring and in lending in a big way. So you see similar kinds of biases coming up in AI models driving assessment of CVs and interview videos for jobs. And there's a number of studies, one particularly impressive one by Su and Karanam Noah in 2023, report experiments on racial bias in loan recommendations. So they train a model on actual loan decisions in the American federal loan industry, the mortgage industry, and what they find is a really strong anti-black bias. And how do they know it's really strong? Well, they do normalization, statistical normalization, where they pair black applicants with control group applicants who have exactly the same or approximately the same income credit profiles, and the discrimination becomes very apparent. They then constructed models where they filter out the bias, which worked fine. The problem is that it yielded a lot of false positives. So many people were recommended for loans who weren't credit worthy. So it's not a straightforward problem. So re-engineering AI systems to eliminate bias in an efficient way is a very serious technological challenge, but it's also a public policy imperative if we want our systems to be fair. Okay. Job displacement and sharp economic inequality is a very serious looming problem. So recent work on impact of AI coming out of places like the OECD confirmed that a large spectrum of skilled non-manual jobs are highly exposed to automation. And these include things like, if you remember the applications I discussed, you can imagine them, tax advisors, clerical workers, legal secretaries, medical diagnosticians, translators, editors, copywriters. So large-scale job displacement with an increasing concentration of wealth in the hands of large tech companies could create really substantial social disruption and political conflict. The problem isn't here one industry, like when horses gave way to cars, the automotive industry could absorb all the people who were thrown out of, or their children anyway, who were thrown out of work in producing horse-drawn vehicles. And similarly with trains. Here, we're talking about a much broader spectrum of automation, which could yield a far more global effect. Now, to avoid the kind of disruption that this would involve, it's going to be necessary to implement measures to create new employment, new kinds of employment, and to provide support for people who are thrown out of work. And that's going to require redistributing income and wealth. That's actually an imperative. The problem, of course, then becomes an issue of social policy and political priority, and we'll talk about that next week. But it is a looming issue, and you can see it arising now in the current American election. Right? I won't mention any names, but who's come out as a strong supporter of Donald Trump and why? Okay, what are the conclusions from all of this? I've actually managed to fin almost in time. First of all, the predictions of superintelligent artificial agents, the notion of the singularity, the kind of Terminator syndrome or phenomena, are based on two, in my opinion, unsound assumptions. The first is that a rapid increase in computational power and increasingly accurate functional simulation of brain activity is going to simply entail intelligence or produce it in electronic circuitry. There's no reason to think that's true. The second is the fact that the singularity is logically possible. Doesn't entail that it's a likely occurrence, right? Yes, we have to grant that it's a possibility. That doesn't mean it's likely. There's no reason to think that current AI systems, or those that we can credibly imagine evolving out of them are going to produce super intelligent agents in the relevant sense. There's just no reason to think that, given what we know about AI systems now. Current work in AI, however, has created a complex of real and present dangers. So I went through a list of, it's not exhaustive by any means, it's just some of them. They might seem each individually manageable. Taken together, they represent a very serious set of social, economic, environmental, and technological threats that we ignore at our peril. They include the full range of environmental, scientific, social, economic, and political problems that I mentioned, plus many others. And these require very immediate and effective responses, which we're generally not getting. We get conferences in which politicians, I've been to many of these, talk about the advantages and possibility of AI, not knowing very much about it, and the need to support AI innovation. I agree with that, but have no concept of what a rational regulatory regime would look like, and much of the verbiage that's expended, including in certain academic environments, doesn't really address it. So these remain open problems. I will try and approach them, at least showing some of the issues that arise when you try and formulate such a policy in the next talk. I will stop here, so we'll have enough time for questioning, and hopefully can get it in before the next fire alarm. Yeah.
I have a comment and a question. The comment is just in response to your passing comment about Trump. The Economist yesterday produced an item which you can find on YouTube, which is asking the question, are Harris's policies being Trumpified?
Sorry, I missed the last
Are
one.
Harris's policies being Trumpified?
Okay.
Meaning that the environment clearly is changing so rapidly that nobody knows what anything means anymore.
Okay.
My question is, and it kind of perturbed me years ago when I was looking at a lot of things, the errors that AI models use, particularly LLMs, are often called hallucinations.
Right.
Why? That sounds very human. These models are not intelligent, they're not human.
Because of their departure from the facts in a sort of effortless way. It's a poetic description.
Indeed, but they're errors.
They're errors only from our point of view, in that the devices are doing what they're designed to do.
Yes, indeed.
And what they were trained to do. But we are interested in addition to fluent speech and reasonable sort of domain-specific responses from training data, we're also interested in factuality. We want to make sure that the systems preserve, if it's a question and answer system, verifiable answers. And when they don't, there was a case I think I gave last time of the lawyer.
Of the lawyer, exactly.
Yes.
This is exactly the point I'm getting at.
Yeah, when
That's clearly an error.
Yes, it's an error. I mean, an error from his point of view and the judge's point of view, not from the system's point of view. He said, find me 6 cases. So it went back and it constructed 6 cases from its training data. The fact that these didn't correspond to actual cases isn't the fault of the language model. It's not designed to be factual.
Indeed, it doesn't know truth.
That's right.
And this is my point. It's almost a case, my interpretation is that the artists fall in love with their model, both literally and figuratively.
Yeah, but verification is a very serious issue if we're going to use these systems as question-answer devices to replace current information retrieval techniques, precisely because we expect them, and if we want to use them for things like financial advice, these become, or medical advice, become very serious. Indeed. So verification is an additional component. Now, multimodality helps because we can ground language in other kinds of data, but it doesn't completely solve the problem. So this remains very much an open problem of, how do we verify?
So my further comment, I trained in econometrics, where you have an idea of the error bounds of output. Forecasting for the weather is like that. But with LLMs, there's nothing that suggests that the veracity of the output is reasonable within plus or minus, pick a number, 5%, 10%, 50%.
That's right, because it doesn't have factuality built in as a constraint.
So these models are therefore potentially risky, i.e. dangerous.
Absolutely. I agree entirely.
Thank you.
Yes, please, at the back, right.
Hi, my question is a bit left of field, but it's quite paradoxical.
Okay.
Is in respect of the implication of AI by extension GPT on academic standards. Right. I know it's on the technical field, but I picked up on a journal that the AI, well, malpractice check softwares are kind of erroneous, sometimes in picking and verifying whether students have, practiced malpractice with artificial intelligence. I was hoping if you could comment on that.
Are you talking about plagiarism or generation?
Precisely.
Plagiarism?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, the problem with evaluating plagiarism is most of the metrics, independently of AI, involve correspondence of content with published content. Okay, and then there are two ways of doing it. One is a strict way where you kind of match n-grams or levels of correspondence with phrases actually used. And the other is a more general way where, where you would use embeddings to match content. Now, the latter way is very dangerous because people can come up with similar ideas which are phrased differently and they haven't plagiarized. The former one is probably more precise but less accurate in the sense that there are very few cases where students would lift whole passages. Well, maybe there aren't. Maybe there are more cases than I'm aware of. So, I mean, the problem of plagiarism is less of an AI issue than it is a more general question of using automatic metrics. And what are the right metrics to use to identify it? I mean, this is a problem from a long time ago. I don't think it's specifically an AI issue, right? There's this kind of metrics of comparing content that you get from someone. It doesn't have to be a student. It can be an author submitting a paper and published stuff, and you want to know to what extent this thing is original. How do you evaluate originality? Those are the metrics, and that's an evaluation problem. There's a lot of work done in it. This is not exactly my area of specialty, so I'm not the best person to answer that. Sorry if it's not a fully adequate answer. Yeah, there are two questions. So one over there, and then yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. I'm trying to think how to formulate this.
You'll have to speak up because it's hard for me to hear.
Okay. I'm trying to think how to formulate this. So with like kind of job displacement, but also like AI in how to say doing creative work, because I know it's a lot of artists are kind of upset about, there's people using AI and it's being trained on bad art. Sorry, not bad, stolen art, I guess.
Yeah.
But I'm also thinking about like creativity in AI, because theoretically, I think if you trained an AI on only like say medieval art and you ask it to create like a modern style art or an impressionist style art, it wouldn't be able to do that well. So there's like, I don't know, like I don't think the AI right now has like real creative potential. But what is the risk of doing that and putting AI into jobs that aren't just like really non-manual and automatic? Like I think more people are trying to put AI in kinds of works that might actually require some sort of creative output. So do you think AI is headed in a direction where it can produce creative output in the human sense, or is it probably not likely to do that, and that would create more risks with putting AI in these kinds of job markets?
Well, for the first question about artists, did you come to the first talk?
No, I didn't.
Oh, okay. So I talked about using generative AI to produce music and also to produce images. It's actually more original and creative than you would think. And I've seen some of the work that a few students have done on using generative AI to, for example, generate guitar compositions and things. I still it wouldn't be my first choice to listen to. Of course, if I listen to a lot of the human-produced music these days, I have a similar reaction, but that's another issue. You get old. I think they're, some of these systems are, I think you're right, they're bounded by training data. But the possibility for innovation, when they're constrained for coherence, et cetera, is bigger than you might think. Will they replace others? I doubt it. I mean, people simply enjoy creating. You might get a symbiotic relationship where, and that's happening already in composition, where people will use a generative AI model to produce an initial composition from a prompt or a musical piece, and then refashion it in terms of what they're trying to achieve, and that seems to me perfectly legitimate. I wouldn't worry about that. The other issue that you raised is an important one, and that's the fact that most of the cases where AI is employed would require human intervention. So things like medical treatment, advice, evaluation for candidacy for surgery, advice on hiring. These should all be the kinds of systems where humans are themselves intervene. That is, none of these systems should be allowed to operate unmonitored. However, keep in mind that humans are the ones who created the biases that the systems incorporate, which doesn't mean you're going to get a fairer or more competent assessment from humans. But surely, some of the more extreme absurdities can be avoided. But I think it is the case that human intervention, at least for monitoring, is very much going to be part of any solution to long-term automation. It will still not produce vast numbers of jobs, right? Because these systems can do the work of many, many statisticians, etc. Yeah.
So, you mentioned that it's very unlikely that AI can take over our lives because you don't even believe in this general intelligence. And I think the point, you made your point. But at the same time, so AI is non-biological, so we don't expect AI to reproduce on its own. But it's something that has to do with cultural evolution. So I wonder whether what you call symbiotic relations is in fact sometimes parasitic one, and that whether it has already taken over, not officially ruling out, but in practice making us dependent on devices or making us less competitive, so that a composer that doesn't use the help, or a researcher that doesn't use ChatGPT will be slower. And so it's maybe AI is already taking over in the sense that you must use it and you cannot be independent in many domains of life.
No doubt. I mean, I think people do use various large language models for things like organization, editing, generating texts. I mean, my foreign students' English has improved enormously to the point that they're within 2 years surpassing me. So I'm assuming that was not done through language learning. That is there to attending. So yes, that's happening. Not all of this is bad. I mean, look. I mean, when I started working at IBM, I would spend 2 days writing code for a program, and then another day debugging it. And this was not physical work, but it was the equivalent of really dumb work, a lot of it, right? And if I could get code generated by a system and simply concentrate on the general software architecture, that's more interesting and creative. So we've always had that connection with technology, which is technology frees us from some sort of relationship. So yeah, I mean, craftsmen become either obsolete or niche and very expensive. And everybody else then uses simpler and more efficient techniques of mass production. I'm not sure that that's a bad thing.
But a potential risk is the dependence. There is this potentially parasitic relationship instead of just symbiotic. So
Yeah,
that's
but I mean, that's true again in
it's a
many areas.
potential.
It's true in, we've become dependent on all sorts of things that, we're dependent on mass transit, we're dependent on home heating, which even 200 years ago, none of this stuff was available. And so I'm not sure this stuff is bad. Some of it is actually freeing us up for other things. But, the stuff that I see as bad is not where it causes dependence, as long as the dependence, produces good results. It's the kinds of things I were enumerating as, I thought, really serious dangers to human, to environmental viability and social and political health. So I don't see being dependent on technology as necessarily in itself. It's kind of neutral. Right. I'm dependent on planes to get me to places where I couldn't go before.
It's just that I'm hearing about 3-year-old children that are dependent on their technology.
On?
Technology, like tablet, and then already.
Yeah, I mean,
3 years
obviously,
old.
you want children to still be able to read and learn music and all of that stuff. And if you don't use things in a creative way, I'm not sure 100 years ago when they were growing up poor and going out to work at the age of 8 that they were sort of freer or happier. Yeah.
I wanted to ask a clarification question.
Yeah.
When you presented 3 indicators for identifying intelligence, you mentioned the use of rational methods to achieve goals.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether you would be able to elaborate on what you meant by rational. Are you taking a hard definition of it, or do you include?
No, I was speaking informally. So, but what I meant was you would use some sort of notion of efficiency. So you'd use the smallest number of resources and the least amount of time to achieve the maximum effect that that kind of engineering efficiency, and you would hopefully cause the least amount of damage to yourself and everyone around you. Those notions that that we sort of apply as a matter of course without even thinking about them. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. I am a lawyer, so I don't know much about anything, but I was very interested in what you said.
I didn't say anything actionable, I hope.
No. I was very interested in what you said, that one of the risks of the commercialization of AI is that there is little work being done on machine learning systems that can infer patterns from small amounts of data.
Yeah.
So from reading, just the very basic stuff, I thought that the ML systems needed a lot of data. I work in data protection, so actually systems that would use small amounts of data would be extremely welcomed by lawyers.
They should, by lawyers, but not necessarily by tech companies.
Yeah, yes, but so would you say that this is possible technically for all fields?
I don't know. I mean, designing small efficient learning systems is to me one of the great engineering challenges of contemporary AI, and people pay it lip service, but it's not being done. There are attempts to build large language models with fewer parameters, while not giving up on performance accuracy. But it's, really seriously powerful learning devices that don't require the kind of massive amounts of training and parameter development that we see now. That work isn't really a priority. And these guys are making a fortune on the systems that they're, OpenAI, which was supposed to be a non-profit outfit. These guys are making an absolute fortune. Google, these AI agents that they're producing, and they're not terribly concerned about the more long-range issues that we're talking about here.
So you're saying it might be actually an excuse rather than a technical necessity to use all that data?
No, I think it's a technical necessity given the current design of the systems.
Okay.
But we should be looking at different design options, and that is not a priority for them.
Thank you.
Yeah. One last question. Let's have one last round because we're getting into, you had a question there. Yes, you.
Sorry,
We'll come back to you.
Just actually bouncing off of that and the earlier question about on the art front. I was wondering your thoughts generally about kind of the copyright.
Okay, that's going to be a major topic when I talk about a rational public policy.
Okay, because the thing that comes
Copyright's a big deal,
yeah, the
both
thing
for training and for output.
okay, well, that's actually exactly what I was going to bring up. Specifically on the art front,
Yep,
you have models built by people like OpenAI, where they would take art which is technically
Sure.
public.
Oh, they're
it's
training on all our data.
put
Yeah.
it in. But they've got, for example, the University of Chicago, they have their nightshade tool and their glaze tool, which I think the nightshade sort of poisons art that's taken and put in things like DALL-E, and it tells DALL-E, for example, that a picture of a cat is actually a picture of a dog. So it damages the AI tool as a sort of,
I see.
and then you have glaze, which stops the art being uploaded at all in the first place.
It's the kind of technological terrorism here.
Yeah, just some of your thoughts on sort of people fighting.
Well, I
that.
wouldn't use those kinds of methods. I think, we'll discuss this in some detail because there are interesting legal precedents that have been set. The lawyers will be interested in hearing some of this stuff. A lot of the public policy issues become legal issues and negotiating different legal systems in different countries, and we'll talk about that. My own feeling is that the more constructive approach is to have these companies pay royalties or fees to the people whose data they're using. And in cases where they're actually producing stuff that closely resembles the things that exist already, again, some sort of licensing fee. I mean, we demand that streaming companies pay for music. That why should they have use of data that other people produce? Now is a legal problem called original use. You can tell us all about this, where if you use something in an original way, you're exempt from copyright violation, and this was a defense by these companies, and we'll come to that. It's a kind of get out of jail free card, and it should not be used to exempt these companies from paying people whose texts, pictures, photographs. There's a famous case of a photograph by an Andy Warhol case. We'll come to that. So yeah, I mean that's on the cards. That's going to be the last talk. Yeah.
Comment. The one word I haven't heard you use either in the first lecture or this one, maybe it'll come up in lecture 3, is simply incentives.
Incentives.
Yes. I.e., all of these issues, the last few questions came up, all point to the issue of incentives. The tech companies have no incentives to protect.
That's right. No,
Incentives to
that's
make.
exactly right. I do discuss that. I'm going to discuss this. That's why I have the third talk.
Yes.
That's exactly what I'm going to be talking about. Look, as a kind of foreshadowing, they're private companies. Private companies are not evil and they're not good. Private companies are in business to make money.
Yeah.
You need them for a market. The idea that you can exist without them seems wrong. On the other hand, if you don't regulate them, they'll destroy you. So obviously the incentive is they will do whatever they can get away with in order to make money. And the whole point of a public domain is to regulate them to make sure that what they do is of public benefit, not only private profit. That's the kind of view I'm going to be trying to develop in that talk. So sure, in fact, to take that a step further, when I was at IBM, which was considered then an old Soviet-style bureaucratic company, the really cool companies were Google and Apple, and the newer ones were still emerging. And the idea was that these were great companies. I would go and visit them, right? People, friends working in Google and stuff, and you had 21-year-old kids with BScs in computer science who were programming, and they would be skateboarding up and down in an open plan office, and pizza boxes, and there was a special room with guitars, and then these were the cool companies, and they were socially responsible, and they were all Greenpeace stickers. And I remember saying to them, this is complete nonsense. There's no such thing as a cool company. There's no such thing as a progressive company. They're not evil and they're not good. They're there for business. They produce a product. You want the product, that's fine, as long as it doesn't harm anyone or that it's useful. But if you don't regulate these guys, all their coolness will amount to nothing. And look what we have. Standard Gilded Age robber baron capitalism, exactly the way we did in the 20s. The difference being that in the 20s, these guys had enough sense to do philanthropy, at least to get income tax deductions. Income tax came in a little later, but these guys are essentially, with the exception of Bill Gates, who does give money, essentially in the sort of I'm cool, I'm producing wonderful technology, I can regulate myself because I know it's good. And that is exactly where things start to go completely wrong. And they have the power to block regulation